The rain didn't just fall that night, it punished the tin roof like it was angry at the world. Wind howled through the broken windows of the tiny farmhouse in rural Texas. But even louder than the storm was the silence that followed her footsteps as she dragged a suitcase down the hall. 13-year-old Elian sat motionless in the corner, arms wrapped tight around little Willa, his 4-year-old half-sister. His shirt clung to his small, pale frame, soaked from the icy draft creeping through the cracked walls. But it wasn't the cold that made him shiver. It was the look on Trish's face. The woman who used to pack his lunch and tuck him in with old country lullabies now stood over him with eyes that no longer looked like a mother's. 6 months ago, they buried his father, and ever since then, Trish had changed her warmth, replaced with something bitter and wild. That change had a name: Dennis. A slick-talking man who smelled like cheap cologne and empty promises. He arrived not long after the funeral, whispering nonsense about rebirth, demons, and karma, slowly poisoning what little love Trish had left. She didn't speak when she threw the notebook on the floor. The pages had been read violated. Elian's private thoughts exposed. The drawings of 2 boys holding hands. His hopes of one day singing on a real stage. His fears. His truth. "You're why he died," Trish had hissed earlier that day, before storming out. "You and your sick spirit. You cursed this house." Elian wanted to scream that it wasn't true, that he loved his dad more than anything, that his father once said Elian's voice was the sky opening. But none of that mattered anymore. Not to Trish, not to Dennis. Now, under a rain-streaked porch light, Trish shoved a duffel bag into Elian's arms. Her other hand yanked Willa's small fingers off her coat. The toddler whimpered, confused, still clutching the stuffed rabbit their father won at the county fair. "We have no room for shadows," Trish snapped. "I'm not going to hell for raising that." She didn't wait for them to speak. She turned her back, slamming the door with the finality of a tomb. Behind it, Elian could hear Dennis laughing, the sound of clinking glasses, and then nothing. Elian stood frozen, trying not to cry for Willa's sake. The gravel bit into his bare feet as they walked, no destination in mind, just away from what used to be home. He remembered stories his dad used to tell about how storms didn't break people. They revealed who stayed standing. That sounded heroic once, but now it felt like a cruel joke. A boy with a shattered family, a sister barely old enough to speak full sentences, and nowhere to sleep but the mercy of a town that already whispered things about him in church pews and gas station lines. Trish didn't just take the house. She took everything: his school books, the piano his dad built from junkyard scraps, and even the insurance money meant for Elian's future. It was gone, handed to Dennis, who promised to open a pawn shop in God's name. But what Trish chose to ignore was that Dennis had a record and actual criminal history of hurting children, charges swept under rugs, sealed files, and paid-off hush. Trish knew. Elian saw the file once, buried in Trish's drawer. He wanted to believe she kept it for protection. But now he knew she had simply chosen to believe the man over the boy who called her mom. As the night stretched and the rain didn't let up, Elian found a bus stop with a broken bench. He laid Willa down and curled his body around hers like a cocoon. She slept fast, trusting him in a way that felt like the last thing left that was pure. Elian didn't cry. Not then. He just listened to the storm, to his heartbeat, to the sound of the world turning without them. Sometimes pain isn't loud. Sometimes it's quiet. Like rain on metal, like the absence of a lullaby. And as Elian watched the horizon fade into black, he didn't know it yet, but his voice, the very thing that got him thrown away, would one day become the song the whole world listened to. Stay with Heart Story for part 2 of Elian's journey from the rain to the redemption. Because sometimes what's thrown away doesn't disappear, it rises. And perhaps the ones left behind aren't broken. They're just waiting to be heard. The sun didn't rise so much as it merely lightened the gray. That morning, the sky over Texas stayed heavy, and the cold air felt like punishment for surviving the night. Elian woke first, his spine aching from sleeping on a concrete step, arms stiff from holding Willa through the storm. Her cough was worse, her breath shallow and quick. Her small body trembled in his arms. Elian pulled her closer, trying to absorb the cold for her. Even though his own clothes were soaked through and his lips were pale, they were still huddled beneath the awning of the old church when the door creaked open late that morning. A short, elderly black woman stepped out. She wore a faded burgundy beret, her gray curls peeking from underneath. Her back hunched slightly, but her steps were certain. She spotted the two children immediately but didn't panic, didn't ask questions, didn't make a show of pity. Instead, she simply opened her arms and said, "Come inside, before this cold steals what your dignity hasn't already lost." Her name was Mrs. Geneva, 70 years old, alone in a small clapboard house a few blocks from the church. She didn't have much a second-hand piano with yellowing keys, a fireplace that coughed more smoke than warmth, and dusty picture frames that hadn't been touched in years. But to Elian, it felt like the safest place on earth. Geneva had once been a gospel singer. Her voice, she said, used to fill cathedrals. But time took her audience, and grief took her son and only child, a boy who died in a house fire far from home after being forced to leave for being gay. Geneva never spoke the details. Only the ache in her voice told the full story. Elian listened. For the first time in weeks, he listened without fear. A few nights later, she heard Elian humming in the dim kitchen as he folded Willa's blanket. No lyrics, just a melody floating from somewhere deep inside him, raw, aching, real. Geneva stood in the doorway, her eyes misting. "You sing like your soul is trying to escape," she whispered. "You should enter Voices of the States." But Elian shook his head. He couldn't, not because he was afraid, but because his leg wouldn't move. Since the fall on the night Trish pushed him down the stairs, his left side had been stiff, unreliable. A doctor had once warned it might never fully recover. And dreams of stages were hard to carry when you couldn't stand. Geneva didn't argue. She simply sat beside him that evening and told a story of her own. She had once sat in the same pews of the same church, singing with joy, until her son told the truth about himself. The church called it shame. Geneva called it courage. For defending him, she was cast out. Her songs were silenced, her community gone. "But I never lost faith," she said softly. "Just found it in different places." Elian didn't reply, but something in him cracked open. He stayed up that night, watching Willa sleep, and whispered melodies into the dark. Not lullabies this time, but prayers in the form of notes. From then on, each day started with Geneva at the piano. She didn't teach technique, she taught release. "Sing what you've never dared to say out loud," she told him. And Elian did. Songs about his father, about being seen as a curse, about watching the world from the sidelines. Willa clapped after every song, her little voice cheering. Again, again. She didn't see the wheelchair or the sadness behind Elian's eyes, only the music. One afternoon, Geneva wheeled Elian into the local audition center. The clerk glanced at the wheelchair and began to dismiss them. Geneva leaned forward. "If he doesn't make you cry in the first 3 bars, we'll leave," she said. "But if he does let America hear him," the man paused, "and let them in. Sometimes, children who are thrown away don't fade, they bloom. Because all it takes is one soul brave enough to open a door and one voice brave enough to step through it." Every morning began with warm tea and music, not polished, not perfect, but real. Elian's wheelchair sat beside the old piano, its wood chipped and worn from years of use. Geneva tapped out chords with slow, steady fingers, pausing to hum harmonies, correcting Elian gently, encouraging him to pull from the pain instead of hiding behind it. Their home became a sanctuary of sound, where grief turned into rhythm and wounds echoed in key signatures. Geneva didn't teach scales. She taught memory. "Sing like your daddy's watching," she would whisper, and Elian did. The songs often came from quiet places, old lullabies his father used to hum while brushing Elian's hair, church melodies he heard through closed doors when Trish refused to let him attend services. Even the silence between verses held meaning now. Every note became a thread, weaving Elian back together note by note, breath by breath. Willa, ever the quiet spectator, had found her own way to participate. One afternoon, while Elian sang a raw, aching version of a melody he titled "The Steps I Fell From," she stood at the far end of the room, clutching an old phone. She pressed record, her hands trembling, trying not to make a sound. The image shook slightly, and the lighting was bad. But what the camera captured wasn't technical skill, it was something deeper. That night, Geneva found the clip and uploaded it to her nearly forgotten social media account. No hashtags, no edits, just a caption. You need to hear this. By morning, it had over 800,000 views. By nightfall, it passed 1 million. Comments poured in from across the country. This voice feels like healing. I haven't cried like this in years. Who is he? And then the message that changed everything, an official invitation from the producers of Voices of the States, offering Elian a spot directly in the live shows. It was a dream come true, but dreams never arrive quietly. Within hours of the announcement, Geneva's old landline rang. She almost didn't answer. But on the other end of the line was a voice she hadn't heard in weeks. Trish. She had seen the video. She had seen the numbers. And now, she wanted Elian back. Except she didn't ask. She claimed that Elian had been kidnapped, that Geneva was a manipulative old woman with no legal right to keep him. Trish wasn't calling out of motherly concern. She was calling because she smelled opportunity, fame, profit, control. What followed was a campaign of deceit. Trish released a heavily edited clip from months prior, Elian sitting on the porch, Geneva adjusting his scarf. Trish spliced the footage to make it appear forceful, unnatural. She framed it as abuse. Geneva, the loving grandmother figure, was recast as a villain by someone who had thrown her own stepson into the night. The internet split. Some stood by Elian, declaring his voice too pure to be fake. Others echoed Trish's lies, demanding Geneva be investigated. News outlets picked up the story. Headlines twisted facts. Elian, the boy with the million-view voice, was now the center of a custody controversy. He didn't speak much during those days, but he didn't stop singing either. Music became his defiance. He recorded another song, Not Yours to Claim, sitting in his wheelchair by the window, Willa asleep on the couch behind him. Geneva posted it without fanfare. And again, it soared. Not because it was polished, but because it was true. The lyrics spoke of bodies discarded, hearts reclaimed, and voices no one could silence. What neither Elian nor Geneva knew was that legal teams had already begun to move. Custody rights, medical records, school documents. Trish was building a case. And in the eyes of a system still slow to protect children like Elian, truth was too often tangled in red tape. But for now, what Elian had, what no one could fake or steal, was a voice, and a story, and a fire that refused to die. Some children are thrown away not because they are broken, but because the world is too blind to see the brilliance in their difference. And sometimes, the only way to reclaim that light is to let the truth sing louder than the lies. The studio lights were blinding. Every inch of the stage gleamed polished floors, shimmering spotlights, and velvet curtains that seemed to swallow the silence whole. But in the center of it all was a wheelchair, black, unadorned, occupied by a boy with a pale face, messy hair, and eyes that had lived too much too soon. Elian didn't smile as the cameras rolled. He didn't wave or look for approval. He kept his eyes closed, hands trembling slightly in his lap as the hum of anticipation filled the air. Behind the scenes, producers whispered about the emotional performance and how to frame the shot. They didn't realize Elian wasn't performing. He was remembering. The piano note rang out first, soft, slow, a pulse more than a sound. Geneva had helped him compose the song just days earlier. The title, My Mother's Silence. It wasn't a plea. It wasn't even an accusation. It was a mirror held up to a world that had looked the other way when love became conditional. Elian's voice began low, like a whisper to himself. The first verse carried memories, the warmth of a lullaby, a shadow standing in a doorway, the click of a lock turning from the inside. Then it climbed, each note a scar turned inside out. He sang about being erased, about dinners eaten in silence, about footsteps walking away. By the second chorus, the audience was still. Not frozen, not awed, just overwhelmed. Grown men blinked hard. Judges sat with hands pressed against trembling lips. Geneva stood backstage, her fingers curled over her chest, not out of worry, but out of reverence. Willa sat with a stage handler, clutching her stuffed rabbit. She didn't understand the lyrics fully, but she felt them. Her tiny hand didn't let go of that toy once. When the last chord hit, Elian opened his eyes, and the room broke. Applause rose like thunder, wave after wave. But Elian didn't hear it, or rather, he didn't need to. He had already released what needed to be freed. What followed tears, standing ovations, trending hashtags was noise. What mattered was that he'd finally said what couldn't be unsaid. That night, the clip aired nationwide. Within minutes, it was viral. And that's when the letter arrived, typed, anonymous, delivered by courier to the show's executive office, no return address, just a message and 2 attached photographs. The letter described a night months earlier, a woman tying a cord across the front steps of a farmhouse, a boy stumbling out the door, the fall, the injury, the scream that never made it to a police report. The photos showed Trish, clear as daylight. The production team handed it to legal. Within hours, local authorities were contacted. Geneva was called into a private meeting. And Elian, exhausted from performance, barely understood what was happening until he saw Geneva crying not from fear, but from release. Trish had been subpoenaed. The custody battle was suspended. Dennis had already fled town, and the state temporarily granted Geneva legal guardianship of both Elian and Willa. Back at home, Geneva knelt beside Elian and held his hand. "This doesn't fix everything," she said, "but it means the next part of your story. It's yours to write." That evening, Elian didn't sing. He sat beside the piano while Willa braided strands of yarn into his blanket. It was the first night in months he felt like a boy, not a case file. And when Willa looked up and asked, "Is it over now?" he didn't answer, because the truth is, some fights don't end. They evolve. When silence is used as a weapon, raising your voice is an act of survival. And when a child finds the courage to sing his pain, the world must decide to listen or to remain complicit in the quiet that harmed him. The night of the finale arrived like a held breath. Cameras, crowds, headlines, it all felt like too much for one boy to carry. But Elian didn't carry it alone. Backstage, Geneva knelt beside his wheelchair, straightening his jacket sleeves and brushing his hair gently. She didn't say, "Good luck." She said, "Be whole." And Elian nodded, because tonight wasn't about winning. It was about becoming. Willa stood behind him, barely reaching his shoulder, wearing a simple yellow dress Geneva had sewn from scraps. She clutched his wheelchair handles like a lifeline. She didn't cry. She just whispered, "I got you, Eli." And he believed her. The curtain rose. The audience stood and Elian sang. The song was called "I Am Still Here." A declaration, not a defense. No intro package, no dramatization, just chords echoing like footsteps returning home. He sang about being erased, about voices that go unheard, about being more than a label, a file, a burden, about not disappearing even when the world pretends you should. And he sang it not as a victim, but as someone who had survived the forgetting. Willa stood behind him the whole time, small hands clutching the chair. At one point, the camera caught her resting her forehead gently against the back of Elian's head. It lasted a second, but that image spread across the country before the performance even ended. When the final note landed, the audience didn't cheer right away. They stood there silent, full, overwhelmed, and then it came. Roaring applause, judges crying openly, entire sections of the crowd chanting his name. Later that night, the votes were tallied. Elian Blake won, but his real victory happened hours later, in a quiet back hallway of the studio, far from the stage lights. A woman sat on a bench, wearing a faded hoodie and a baseball cap pulled low. She had stayed behind while others exited, silent through the after-party, unnoticed among the crowd. But when she heard Elian sing, her body shook. When he said, "I'm still here," her hands clenched until her knuckles whitened. Geneva noticed her first. Something in the woman's eyes, familiar and distant at the same time. And then the woman removed her cap. Her eyes matched Elian's, so did her cheekbones and the scar on her right brow. She didn't speak, just wept, because she knew she didn't deserve a word. She was Elian's birth mother. She had been forced, at 16, to give him up after becoming pregnant with her husband's best friend, a secret buried by her conservative family. The shame, the fear, the silence. It had all led to a decision she never forgave herself for. And now the boy she never held was on national television, reclaiming every piece of himself she had been told to erase. She left before Elian saw her, but Geneva did, and said nothing. Some reunions aren't for cameras. Some healing begins in silence. Back at home, the next morning, Geneva found a letter on the porch. It was from the same church that had once expelled her for defending her son. In neat handwriting, they apologized, invited her back, not to the pews but to the pulpit. The world had seen what grace looked like. And finally, it wanted to learn. Elian didn't need a crown or a title. What he had was a story, a sister, a second chance, and a voice the world could never unhear. If you had the chance to tell the world your truth, even after they tried to silence you, what would you say? Tell us below. And don't forget to subscribe to Heart Story for more stories that matter, stories that heal, and voices that refuse to be forgotten.